In this part 2, we are going to be working with the verb to do. If you haven't watched part 1 yet, I highly recommend that you do so that way you can understand the concepts in this part 2. Although these videos are for intermediate or advanced English learners, anyone is welcome to watch. If you need to, please pause or stop the video at any time to take notes, as well as to practice your pronunciation. Let's get started. On this first slide, we'll briefly review how to use to do as a helping verb. To do is used as a helping verb for emphasis and to create negative statements, which are all talked about in part 1. For this video, we'll talk about how do and does can be used to form questions. And so it's important to ask this question, when can we use do or does in questions? And so we can use do or does as a helping verb to form questions when there is a main verb in the sentence that we are trying to turn into a question. A good example would be you ride bikes with the main verb underlined, which is ride. It turns into do you ride bikes? You can put do or does with any verb to create a question. However, an exception or the exceptions would be to be and modal verbs. Here we have you are a biker. The question that we can turn this into is, are you a biker? We can't say, do you are a biker? Here we have the modal verb can. Can you bike is correct, but do you can bike would not be correct. And so when it comes to using do or does as a helping verb, you really need to be careful about which verbs you try to pair them with. However, if do or does is in a question, but it's the main verb, you can pair them with any modal verb, including can. For example, can you do the biking? And so that is correct to say. Now that we discussed when to use do or does in questions, we will talk about 4 main question forms. So the first 2 are called first and second form positive. The second forms are called first and second form negative questions. So I'm not sure if any other English resource uses these types of labels or terms, but I use them because I think that they will help you to understand how to form questions with do or does. And so let's talk about the first form and second form positive. For the first form, you have questions that begin with do or does. A good example we have here is, do you like to eat breakfast? We can answer questions like this with yes or no, but we don't have to. You can also find an option or multiple options in the question itself to include in your answer to the question. And you can answer questions like these with do or does. For the second form, we have who, what, when, why, where, or how. So our question starters, plus the verb do or does, depending on the subject pronoun used. Our example would be, what do you like to eat? And so questions like these in the second form, you cannot answer them with yes or no. They typically don't have an option or options in the question for you to include in your answer. And it's not really recommended to use do or does for confirmation when answering these types of questions. And so I think it's important to talk about the first and second forms more in detail. But before we do, let's look at some conjugations. And so here we have to do in the simple present tense and its conjugated forms. And then here we have sort of the same organization or chart, except we put do or does to make a question out of our pronouns. And so repeat after me. We'll start with singular pronouns. Do I? Do you? Does he, she, it? Do we? Do you? And do they? Excellent. And so here we have some awesome examples of first form positive questions. We have do or does plus the subject, which is either a noun or a pronoun. And then at the end, we have our main verb. And so I want you to keep in mind that when you're working with does or third person singular pronouns like he, she, or it, the main verb in that question has to drop the S, ES, or IES ending. And for part one, we talked about this. So if you have something such as he reads, when you add does to the sentence, it will read, he does read. The S is dropped from read. It's the same thing that happens to other verbs such as goes and studies. And so if we apply that here to this slide, you'll see our example, does Kevin like music? The S in the like has to drop because you have does in the question. And so a good rule to remember is that when it comes to first form positive questions, you can answer them with yes or no, but it is optional. And as you can see, the questions have options or an option in themselves that you can use in your own answer in response to the question. And so some helpful examples are, do you feel ill? Yes, I do feel ill. Does Dan write books? Yes, Dan does write books. Do the Johnsons live on this block? I could say yes, but I could also say no. The Johnsons do not live on this block. And so for this particular answer, I have to use either do not or don't. So I have to use the negative form because I answered with no. But for the other two answers, I use do or does as confirmation. I'm confirming what the person has asked because the examples or the options are specifically in the question. And so do you feel ill? I can include feel ill, so that option in my answer. And so here we have another example of a first form positive question, except we have multiple options to choose from. Does Kevin like music or sports? And here we have other examples with multiple options such as, do you feel good or bad? Yes, I do feel bad. Here we have Does Dan write books, articles, or letters? Yes, Dan does write books. Do the Johnsons live on this block or on another? Yes, the Johnsons do live on another block. And so I can say yes for this third question because on another is an option that I can choose from. And so I'm confirming one of the options that the person has given in their question. And so here, this is a slide again from part 1 that just gives an overview of using do for emphasis. The last option is an example of how to use to do for emphasis, specifically for confirmation. So that's essentially what we're doing for these examples. Now we can address the second form where you have who, what, when, where, why, or how plus do to form a question. And so here we have sort of our conjugated chart, except now we have our 6 sentence starters. Please feel free to repeat after me. Who do I? What do you? When does he, she, it? Where do we? Why do you? How do they? And so because there are 6 sentence starters, I decided to put them for each of the 6 pronouns. However, as you may be aware, you don't have to use who specifically for I or what for you. You can say, where do I? Or when do you? Here are some examples of second form positive questions. Here we have who, do, plus the subject and the main verb. And here we have what, does, plus the subject and the main verb at the end. And so continuing with Kevin, we have what does Kevin like? And so when it comes to questions like these, as stated before, they cannot be answered with yes or no. So you have no option. You cannot answer them with yes or no. And these questions typically don't have an option or options within itself that you can use in your answer. And so this gives you more flexibility when choosing what to include in your answers. And so here are some other good examples, such as when do you feel ill, which doesn't give us a specific option or time frame to choose from. So I can say, I feel ill in the mornings. For the second question, what does Dan write? I can say, Dan writes nonfiction books. For the third question, where do the Johnsons live? They live on another block. And so none of these answers include yes or no, and they don't include do or does for confirmation, because even though you are giving someone information, you're not specifically confirming what they've said, because there are no options, or there is no option to choose. And so now that we've looked at first and second positive questions, let's practice our pronunciation of questions from each form. When you see the icon or the picture, please repeat. Do you like green trees? Do you like green trees? Excellent. What does Linda eat? What does Linda eat? Where does he work at night? Where does he work at night? Excellent job on the pronunciation activity. Now let's do a quiz in which you will choose the correct answer or answers to the first or second form positive question presented. Feel free to pause at any time so you can look at your options and choose the best answer or answers. Do you like green trees? No. No, I don't like green trees. Yes, I do. I don't know. Which would be the best option or options? Again, feel free to pause if you need to for any of these quiz items. Let's look at our answer. And so all of these are correct because you can answer this question with a simple no or yes, and you can answer this question with I don't know, especially if you are unsure if you like green trees. What does Linda eat? Spinach. She eats spinach. Yes, she eats spinach. Let's look at our answers. And so A and B are correct. You wouldn't answer this second form positive question with C because it has yes. Here we have a question with two options to choose from, and we have or underlined, and so that's important to keep in mind when trying to choose the correct answer or answer for this question. Do you like cats or birds? Yes, I like cats and birds. Yes, I like cats. No, I do not like cats or birds. Which would be the best option or options? And so B and C are correct. So yes, I like cats and birds would be perfectly fine if the question read, do you like cats and birds? Because in that case, you would be confirming with yes that you like both options. However, since we have or instead of and, we can only use yes to confirm one option. So, yes, I like cats, or yes, I like birds. If you wanted to still respond to this question with I like cats and birds, you can do so. However, you would not use yes. So, do you like cats or birds? I like cats and birds without yes. Because in that case, you wouldn't be using yes to confirm what the person is saying. They are saying or, which means you have to confirm either cats or birds. And so I hope that this makes sense. Honestly, when you are speaking with English speakers, you might have someone who answers this question with A. Yes, I like cats and birds. Even though it's technically not correct to do that, the person or the people who are around them will understand what they say. I don't want you to feel overwhelmed or stressed out with and or questions. Here we have a good question. Do we need plates for dinner? No, we do need plates for dinner. Yes, we do need plates for dinner. We do. Are you ready to look at our answers? And so B and C are correct. We can't use A because it has no. Here we have our last question of this quiz, which is, why do you feel sick? Our options are, I don't know. I feel sick because of the food. Yes, I feel sick because of the food. Yes. And so take a moment to think about your answer. And so let's take a look at the answer. And so A and B are correct. Again, you can answer any question with I don't know. However, when it comes to second form positive questions, we cannot use yes or no. And so that is why C and D are incorrect. And so nice job, everyone. Now that we looked at the first two forms, we'll take a look at the next two forms, which are negative, meaning that they have the word not in the questions. And so for the first form, negative, we have do plus the subject plus not, and then the main verb at the end. However, because we have not, we can combine it with do to create the contraction don't. This is the same with does. And so what does plus subject plus not plus the main verb. If you want to make that more concise, you can do so again with the contraction doesn't. So what doesn't subject main verb. And so when you hear negative questions in conversations, you're most likely going to hear contractions such as don't or doesn't. And so here we have more specific examples with don't you write and what doesn't Kevin like. And so when it comes to first form negative questions such as don't you like to eat breakfast? You can answer these questions with yes or no, just like first form positive. Again, it's optional. These questions typically have options or an option within itself that you can use in your answer. And you can use don't or doesn't in your answers because it's a negative question. That means you are going to have a negative answer for the most part. For the second form example, we have what don't you like to eat? And so again, just like second form positive, we cannot answer these types of questions with yes or no. They don't have options to choose from in themselves. However, you can answer these questions with don't or doesn't depending on the subject. And so if I were to answer the question, what don't you like to eat? I can say, I don't like to eat spaghetti. If I were to answer, don't you like to eat breakfast? I can say, yes, I don't like to eat breakfast. However, sometimes these types of questions are not easy to answer. And so, continuing with our example, don't you like to eat breakfast? These types of questions can be literal, meaning that if a person is asking this question, they really mean to say, don't you like to eat breakfast? However, don't you like to eat breakfast can mean, do you like to eat breakfast? When someone is shocked, surprised, or even confused about something, let's say they ask you if you eat pancakes and you say no, they might be confused or surprised and say, don't you like to eat breakfast? When they really mean, do you like to eat breakfast? And so if someone's being literal, you would answer this question by saying, yes, I don't like to eat breakfast. But if someone really means to say, do you like to eat breakfast? You can answer with, yes, I do like to eat breakfast, to confirm this is what you do. Here we'll do another quiz. Again, we'll choose the correct answer or answers to the question, which will either be first or second form negative. Here we have, don't you like green trees? Which is a literal question. So the person means, do you not like green trees? And so an option would be, yes, I don't know, or yes, I like green trees. And so let's look at our options. So A and B are good options to choose from. Wouldn't choose C because the person actually means, don't you like green trees? What doesn't Linda eat? Broccoli. She doesn't eat broccoli. No, she doesn't eat broccoli. Let's look at our answers. And so A and B are correct because with C, you can't answer a second form positive or second form negative question with no. And then our last question, don't we need plates for dinner? Here, the person is not being literal. They really mean, do we need plates for dinner? Because they're confused or surprised. Yes, we do need plates for dinner. Yes, we don't need plates for dinner. We do. And let's look at our answers. And so A and C are correct. Again, because this is non-literal, B is incorrect. And so now that we finished our quizzes, we can review what we've learned. Here we have our positive first form and second form questions. For the first form, you can answer questions like, do you like to eat breakfast, with yes or no, but it's optional. They typically have the options in the questions, and you can use do or does for confirmation in your answers. For the second form questions like what do you like to eat, they cannot be answered with yes or no. They typically don't have an option in themselves to choose from. And it's recommended to not use do or does for confirmation in your answers because there are no options being given to confirm. And here we have the negative first form and second form. So for the first form, questions such as, don't you like to eat breakfast, can be answered with yes or no. They have options. And depending on whether it's literal or non-literal, your answers can vary. When it comes to second form questions with sentence starters such as who, what, when, where, why, or how, you cannot answer these questions with yes or no. They typically don't have options in the question, but you can use don't or doesn't in your answer depending on the subject used. Congratulations, everyone. You finished this part 2. And so, as always, we will conclude by looking at a Bible verse. And so, this verse is from the book of John, chapter 11. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection, I am life. Everyone who believes in me will have life even if they die. And everyone who lives and believes in me will never really die. Martha, do you believe this? And so here we have do being used in this question so that way Martha can reflect on and think about what she really believes or who she really believes in. As Christians, we believe that Jesus is the resurrection. He gives us eternal life, and that should encourage us not only in our everyday activities, whether it's work, spending time with family, or learning the English language, but it's supposed to give us the hope of eternal life with Him. Thank you guys for watching the video, and I hope to see you next time.